Hello and welcome. I'm going to give this just a little bit of time to see if anybody will be joining me. So if you are here, I would love for you to say hello. Welcome. So let's just take this time to settle in on this Friday afternoon or evening or Saturday, whatever time it is where you are. Just take a few moments to be present, settle in. Take a few deep breaths together. It's been a while since I've done a live on YouTube, so I would love for you to say hello and let me know that you're here. I know there are a lot of you that watch this channel but do not follow me on social media, so we don't have as much opportunity to connect. So if you are on social media and you're not following me on Facebook or TikTok, make sure to do so we can stay connected a little bit better. And of course, if you haven't signed up for my email list, make sure you do that too. I share all kinds of things, updates and new things available there as well. Hi, Isabella. Hi, Kelly. Hi, Diane and Cecilia. Welcome, everybody. Happy Friday or Saturday. So I'm just going to see if I can get to my live video here. I cannot. So welcome. So today I want to talk about, please do say hello. Keep saying hello as you come in. Hello, Barbara. Good to see you. So I'm actually doing this video because, well, I think it's a very important topic in general, but it really is something that tends to hold people back in a lot of different ways in our lives. And sometimes we might be really aware of it, and a lot of times we're not. And as you've heard me say before, the things that we're not necessarily really aware of tend to have the most significant impact. So being able to really recognize how shame might be showing up, I think is really important. And part of the reason that I'm doing this right now is because inevitably, every time that I am about to start a group, there are people that will share that, whether it's privately or publicly, that will share that, well, they thought about it, but maybe it's not the right time, or they thought about it, but they're not quite ready. They thought about it, but it just feels way too overwhelming. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of uncertainty, they're afraid of judgment. They think that they're going to be so different than everybody else. And so I want to address this specifically. So this isn't just about people coming into my group. This is about being able to really recognize and, in a sense, push through shame that is holding you back from something that you desire to do, something that you know could be beneficial for you if the fear of having that shame or experiencing that shame wasn't quite so strong. So this really is something that I see in so many ways. It holds us back in relationships, without a doubt, both friendships and romantic relationships. It holds us back in going after experiences that we want, whether it's like a career type of experience or an adventure type of experience, or even just a hobby. And whether that's involvement with other people, or even if it's a hobby that doesn't require much involvement with somebody else, but if we feel shame, which means that we believe that we are unworthy, shame and unworthiness are tied together. If we believe that there's something basically inherently wrong with us, then even something that is a very solo type of activity, and for some reason crocheting is coming to mind, like you want to do that, but then you're not sure. And just the idea of trying something like that, that you know might be really good for you, you might enjoy it, and it certainly might help with your stress levels. But maybe you fear that you won't be good at it. Maybe you're worried that other people are going to think it's silly or stupid or a time waste or a waste of resources. So there's a fear of judgment or failure, something like that. And again, consciously, you may be aware of these thoughts and you may not be. But if shame can hold us back from something kind of as simple as an activity that you would do on your own, that nobody else would really even have to know much about at all, then imagine the impact that it has when we are taking real risks, where there is a risk of judgment, there is a risk of feeling really awkward, embarrassed, or having that shame come up, where you might be in a situation where you find yourself comparing, and you've heard me say before about comparing, right? That comparing, for those of us who have this history, comparing almost always ends in us feeling like we have proof or evidence that we're not enough, that there's something really wrong with us, that we're not good enough. So I'm going to talk about it kind of in this particular context in regards to the fears that hold people back around doing a group. But again, this could be about going to therapy. It could be about telling somebody that you care about them, asking a new friend out for coffee. Like, it could really be so many different ways, asking your boss for a raise, all different kinds of ways this can show up. So with this example of healing, so not even specifically about group, but with the example of healing, there are going to be a lot of things that are going to be beneficial in your healing, that you might even have the sense that you should do, that you know that if you do it, it's likely going to help in your healing, or at least that's what somebody's told you. So you're kind of trusting that. There might even be a part of you that feels like it would be good, or if it could really work out and you could not feel so much stress about shame or stress about being rejected or whatever, that it might actually be a pleasant experience. So you've got this one part of you that is feeling like, yeah, I think I want to do that. There's something happening in your body that you feel this anticipatory feeling. You're drawn to it. There's a part of you that is saying yes. But then that survival part of you, that part of you that holds on to the doubt and tries to keep you safe, is saying, no, it's not a good idea. What if this happens? What if that happens? And I know that you can relate to that, no matter what it is, right? We go through that whole scenario of 101 things of what could or might happen. And it's all based on fear. And it's almost always based on the ideas that we hold about ourselves. So if we believe that we are unworthy deep in our core, even if there's a part of you that believes that you are, but when you're feeling vulnerable, you come back to that belief that you're not enough, then the idea of putting yourself out there in some way feels scary. That survival part of you kicks in and says, no, it's safer to stay back here. And in order to keep you back there, that survival part is going to kind of remind you of all the things that it's said over the years to keep you from allowing yourself to do something that feels really vulnerable. Because it's safer. Because your nervous system doesn't know the difference between something that is actually going to be beneficial and something that isn't. It's responding to what happens immediately in your body. And any sort of feeling of uncertainty or doubt or fear creates that self-protective mechanism to kick in. And that's part of the reason why really pretty much everything in healing is a practice, because we have to continue to practice being in that place of fear or doubt or uncertainty, sitting with it for a moment, reminding ourselves that it's okay, and then pushing through that to do that thing. Now, of course, there are going to be times that we do that thing and it doesn't feel good, and maybe it is not helpful at all. But there are also a lot of times, if we're able to really experience it as a whole, that when you allow yourself to step into healthy vulnerability, you then get to experience that all that fear, and even your nervous system gets to experience that you can feel all that doubt, all that need to hide, that desire to run away, that you can feel all of that and still move in through that vulnerability and experience something on the other side of that that you've maybe never really allowed yourself to experience before. And that action by itself is healing. So that is a practice for healing by itself. And of course, depending on what it is, there's more healing that can happen as a result of that. But just allowing yourself to recognize that you're feeling this, recognizing what all the doubts and fears are, and any shame that might be there, and then being able to sit with that and then do that thing anyway. That is, in part, large part actually, how you heal. Now, of course, there's more to it than that, but that is a big part of it, because that's part of that process, even of deciding to seek therapy, right? Most people I've known, if not everybody I've known, when they go to therapy, when they first go to therapy, or I see a new therapist even, there is a lot of doubt, uncertainty, maybe even shame, like, I don't know if I can talk about this, what if they don't believe me, those kinds of thoughts. But then you go anyway, right? And just the act of going is a healing experience. And then hopefully you have a good experience. You're able to feel somewhat comfortable. There's nothing that makes you feel like you were judged. So that entire thing then, actually going, the experience of sitting there with a therapist and talking, all of that becomes part of your healing practice and experience. And then each additional time, you build on that. Your system begins to recognize that that fear can be there. But when you push through it, there's healing that happens, there's growth, there's change that happens. But if you don't push through it, and again, I'm talking about healthy things, so I want to be really clear about that. If you don't push through it, then we are within our nervous system and in our belief system affirming that it really is not safe to do that, that isn't the right thing, the healthy thing, the better thing. That's not the best thing to do. What is best is to stay over here, because then I feel more control. I feel a sense of safety because I know what to expect here and I don't know what to expect over there. So even if you think about this in terms of a new job, right? Like, you might have a job that every day it feels like it sucks the life out of you and you're miserable and you hate going to work. All of those things, like, it could be really not a pleasant experience. But if you fear that you're not going to be able to get a different job, and then you'll feel like a failure if you can't, if you are afraid that you're not good enough to get a different job or the job that you want or the promotion that you want, then that fear, that shame, because you're not enough, can keep you from doing that. And then that affirms that that's the best thing for you to do because that feels better. But if you never push through that and ask for the promotion or apply for a different job, then you never get an experience that can show you, that can prove to you that that fear is baseless, that the shame that you're feeling is not something that other people think or see. Because one of the things about shame is that because it is such an ingrained, deep-seated idea and belief and fear that we hold, even if not consciously, we have an assumption that other people can see it. And that if you share anything at all, they're going to see those deepest, darkest places that you've worked really hard for nobody to ever see or know. So, safety. But you still don't feel safe, right? Every day you live your life, you're still afraid of somebody finding out. You're still thinking, what if somebody knew? Whether it's a friend or a potential partner, well, if they knew this, then they wouldn't be interested. And maybe what this is at that particular time is, I really want this job, but I'm too afraid to go after it. And that's an important thing about shame too, is it doesn't have to be something like really big or dark. And certainly it doesn't have to be something that we should be ashamed of. And I've talked about that many times. But that doesn't mean that we don't still feel shame, that we don't believe that the shame exists for a really true reason. Basically, that we deserve to feel shame. So, no matter what it is, I think it really is important to work toward, and this is part of the practice, to work toward really being able to sit with, okay, what is this fear really about? What am I afraid of happening if I do this thing? And acknowledge that. Maybe even write down all the things. And you can even ask yourself then, when has been another time in my life that I've been afraid of any of these happening? So if you're afraid you're going to fail, if you're afraid somebody's going to think something about you and treat you in a certain way, are there times that you've had that same fear, but that fear did not come true? Because I can feel pretty confident that no matter who is watching this right now, that will absolutely be the case. Now, are there going to be times that you could look at that and say, are there times that it did come true? Quite possibly, especially if you are somebody that experienced a lot of childhood trauma and you're still in the healing process. And so therefore, maybe your boundaries are not really great. Maybe you're still not believing enough in yourself to be around people that treat you with respect and dignity. Maybe you're not asking for what you want. So is it possible those things could certainly happen? Absolutely. But it's not because of who you are. Maybe you're choosing to share something with somebody who hasn't really shown you that they can respect and validate. Maybe they haven't really earned the right to hear the thing that you want to share. And that is also a really important thing to consider, because a lot of people have shared with me, well, I tried talking to somebody and it didn't work out. I tried with several people and they just kind of shut me down. And that's heartbreaking, and it can feel devastating when you're experiencing it in that moment. But it is important to look at, who are the people that you tried to share with? Because that makes a huge difference. And the reality is, for many of us, the people that we surround ourselves with before and during the healing process, especially early on, are people that in some sense or another likely don't have the capacity to be with us in those moments or to hear the things that we want to share. But that's not evidence that you will never be able to experience that, or that you are unworthy of having healthy people or support in your life. So really practicing being in that place of discomfort and then choosing to step into something that maybe feels vulnerable or risky within reason and with a healthy person, if the person is part of this, that is part of what is necessary for healing. In my Journey to Wholeness course, the big course, in one of the sections, part of it is about stepping into vulnerability. And it's always interesting to to see people or to hear from people about their reactions to that chapter, because it is challenging and it can feel incredibly overwhelming. But it's also necessary for healing. And when you really think about, or for me anyway, when I think about, because of the work that I've done and the people that I've been fortunate enough to work with, it really is so heartbreaking to think about the ways, and honestly, even for myself, when I think back, the ways that we limit, like really put these incredible limits on what we allow to be available for us. It really is quite amazing. No, that's not for me. I can't do that yet. I'm not ready. Well, I'll do that once I do this, right? We put all these stipulations on the thing that we want. We put it off until we ultimately think that we're going to be ready and we won't fail, or that we're healed enough to do it, or some other thing that isn't really the thing. It's just the fear. So I encourage you to think about that, to think about how are you holding yourself back because of shame, believing that you're not enough, fear of failing, fear of judgment, thinking that you have to reach a certain point about who you are or where you are in your life before this next thing can happen. Because all of that is just about your survival mechanism trying to keep you in this little box so you can be safe. But in this little box, you're not really living your life. So I would love to hear from you. Thoughts, questions, comments. Hi, Amanda. Hi, Jolanta. I'm not quite sure how to say that. It's a beautiful name. Cecilia left. I don't know when she left, but it will be on the channel at least for a little while. So if you haven't yet said hello, I would love for you to. And if you've got questions about anything really, shame or a group. So if you don't know, and I think there's more people here, I think, than what I can see, but if you have, hi Kara, if you have thought about ever joining me, so even if you're watching this on replay, if you have ever thought about participating in something with me, this is a great opportunity to jump in. We'll be together for 8 weeks in a private Facebook group. I know a lot of you are not on Facebook, and I'm sorry, but Facebook just seems the best place to have a community, because the connection, the posts and the prompts, it's all within Facebook. It's just a much more effective place to be. So maybe even join Facebook just to join our group, but that's where the group will be held. But it's 2 months together of just leaning into that vulnerability, connecting, sharing, a space to know that you're not alone. and to really practice and connect with the truth that there is nothing for you to be ashamed of, to feel accepted. There's a lot that goes into it. Yolanta. Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Hi, Nicole. So there is a link up at the top. I can pin that. So at the top, there is a pinned comment with a link. If you have any questions after this video is done, feel free to reach out. We start on Monday the 6th. It is for women, and we'll be together for 8 weeks. So I would love to have you join if you're thinking about it. It's not a long commitment, it's just 8 weeks. And we already have some incredible women that have been a part of many of my groups, which says something, right? Because I can feel pretty confident in saying that pretty much everybody that's probably joined a group of any type of healing group anyway, but certainly in my groups, that everybody has felt some level of apprehension, if not outright panic, in thinking about it. And yet, I would say probably 98% of the people that have joined my groups join another one. So, in fact, I think there's only been, that I can think of, maybe a few people in all the different groups that I've done. And there can be any number of reasons for that. But because people continue to join, I think it does say something about the benefit of being in a space. And I've done all different types of groups in terms of length of time and how deep we've gone and stuff like that. And the people join all of them. So if you've ever thought about it, I would encourage you to really let yourself notice, what is it that's holding you back? And is it some of those fears that I mentioned? And what is the worst thing that could happen if you decided to join? And I think it is important to really kind of think about that, because if it's, what if I'm judged? In reality, and I'm certainly not minimizing this. So the idea, what if I'm judged, or what if people think this or that thing about me? In reality, if that is a fear of yours, that is something you're already living with. As you go about your day, you have that fear. You are living with that fear on a regular basis, whether it's at the forefront of your mind or back there swimming around somewhere, but it's impacting how you feel in your day-to-day life. So if the worst thing that could happen is somebody judges you, which I can feel pretty confident, obviously I can't guarantee this, I can feel pretty confident that that will not happen in my group. And I can say that in part because I know the women that are in there. Everybody who has signed up, I know them. And they've participated, I believe everybody at this point has participated in a group with me before. So I have absolutely no doubt that you would be very warmly accepted. So I'm not concerned that somebody would be judged, but I know it's a reasonable concern to have. But if that is the worst fear, you're already living it. So if it happened in that space, it would be bad, and I certainly would be upset about that, but you're already living it. So I hope that makes sense. Because I think it is important to recognize, when we think about what is our worst fear, or what are the fears that we have, much of it is stuff that we're already dealing with, stuff that we already believe that other people think or feel. And yes, you could say, well, it will be proof that that is true. And in a sense, I can argue the point that it isn't really proof that it is true, but it could certainly feel that way. It could be experienced that way. And that would be heartbreaking to me that you would feel that you would end up experiencing that. And it would be hard for you. But I also know that when that tends to happen in a group environment, so I've done groups in person as well as online, and even for other people who have done groups, while there are things that can happen that can leave us feeling a certain way, much of the time it's more about a misunderstanding, a reading into something that was not actually intended. And that is, I will say, one of the downsides about participating virtually versus being able to be in a space together, because then you're not getting all the nonverbal cues from somebody. But even within that context, that's a it's a pretty rare thing that will happen, because the women that tend to participate in my groups are like a lot of survivors, that we tend to be very mindful, right, of how we're showing up and how other people are feeling. So I think it's a good way to think about that. Thank you all for sharing. Barbara says, even with all the healing I've done, and I can acknowledge the healing that I've done, I can still feel surprised with how shame and fear show up in my life, especially when I'm struggling. Barbara, thank you so much for sharing that. And that, I think, is a really important point too, that the more vulnerable we are, and again, anything can make us vulnerable. Not enough sleep, not feeling well, being stressed out about like work can affect our intimate relationships in terms of vulnerability. So any vulnerability that we are feeling tends to make those things come to the surface more. And even just thinking about going to therapy, thinking about joining a group. And I would say that much of the time joining a group feels much more vulnerable than going to therapy, because it's one person versus a group. That vulnerability is intense feeling. But part of the reason it's so intense is because it feels like there's so much to lose. There's so much that is unknown. But if you think about this, I don't know why this analogy just came to mind, but if you think about swimming, if you didn't swim as a young child and suddenly you're 20 years old and you see this pool that's, I don't know, 12 feet deep, you're going to feel really intimidated. You're likely going to feel really uncomfortable if you don't really know that much about swimming and you've never swum before. And if you just keep looking at the pool, your anxiety is likely going to increase. Like if you look at it day after day or week after week or year after year, you're likely going to increase your level of fear about the water. Because each time you feel the fear and you don't do it, it's evidence that that's the best thing to do. You were safe because you didn't go into the pool. So then when you see the pool, you have more desire, more physiological desire or need to pull back, because you've proven to yourself that the safe thing is to not get in. But then you dip your toe in and you realize, okay, well, that doesn't feel too bad. And then maybe you walk down a step or two. There's a shallow end too. You walk in a step or two and you think, okay, this isn't so bad, right? Well, most of you probably have swam, and so no shame if you haven't, but most of you probably have. So you do it kind of in a gradual way, or in a way that you get to teach your body and your mind that it is okay, that water is not necessarily something to be afraid of. Now, of course, some people have had near drowning experiences, and that's kind of a whole different thing. So forget this analogy if that is the case. But then once you get in and you realize that you can actually float, then you don't have that same response every time. Now, if it's a new body of water, you might feel some of that because it's unknown. That body of water is unknown. And so anything related to your healing journey could be kind of similar. So for example, if you are part of your like homework or whatever is exploring ways to meet people, or exploring what friend you might like to build a closer relationship with, you're going to feel some vulnerability around that. But when you allow yourself to explore it and learn to feel that discomfort before you do it, then it makes doing it much more attainable. If you decide, if the homework is you're going to leave your therapist's office and you're going to call somebody and go meet with them and share everything, well, that's likely not going to happen because you don't have the opportunity to feel into the discomfort and work through it. So I feel like I kind of went off on a little bit of a different thing there, but what helps with the distorted thinking? Yolanta, I think it would depend on what kind of distorted thinking it is. If you could maybe share a little bit more, I'd be happy to address it a little bit more specifically. Diane says shame shows up for me in a lot of ways. And that's one of the things about shame, is that it really can show up in every aspect of our lives. Again, sometimes it might be really prominent and sometimes it's just in the background, but it does influence the things that we feel ashamed about, influence everything about how we show up and interact in the world. Kelly says, I'm not completely sure what I'm afraid of, but I definitely feel fear. Outright panic is probably a way to describe it. And that sense of panic is really not only intense, but when we panic and we pull back from whatever that thing is, what our body is experiencing in that moment is that the panic causes you to pull back, and the pulling back is what creates the safety. And kind of an ironic thing about that is you don't really feel safe, right? In fact, you might actually feel more shame because you feel ridiculous, or whatever word you might use, for being afraid or for feeling the fear or the panic or whatever. And of course, that's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's this kind of vicious cycle that you can really find yourself in. Diane says, your groups are excellent. Thank you, Diane. Hi, Megan. Alice says, I have a lot of shame and lots of fear. You're definitely not alone. And that's one of the things about shame too, is that the things that we feel ashamed of, we can often look at somebody else who maybe has felt similarly or experienced something similar, and like not judge them, not blame them or look at them like they're ridiculous for feeling the way that they do or struggling in the way that they do. But yet we feel shame for the same exact things, which I think maybe is kind of an interesting point to look at in terms of, so if we don't actually judge anybody for that same thing, maybe the shame that we're feeling isn't really something that we need to hold on to. And I didn't necessarily think of it in that specific way related to shame, but that was a big part of my own healing process, is being able to kind of look at things in that type of a way. But while I don't know what your shame is around, Ellen, you certainly don't need to share here. I can say this with incredible confidence, that because you're watching me right now, it can let me know probably a little bit about you. And with that in mind, I can very confidently say that the things that you're holding the most shame around have never been yours to hold. Never. And yeah, you might be able to say, yeah, but whatever that yeah, but is, it doesn't change what I just said. And part of the reason I can confidently say that is because in the work that I've done over the years, I've had so many conversations with people around things that they feel ashamed of. And there's a lot of commonality through that. A lot of the same things that people say over and over again, different people say over and over again. And how deeply they believe that for them, that shame is warranted, though it wouldn't be for somebody else, which of course is not true. It's not based in reality. But when we feel that shame, it is a really hard thing to allow ourselves to let in the possibility that maybe it really isn't something for us to be ashamed of. And shame, I do believe, is the most destructive thing that we experience as humans, probably in general, but as survivors of childhood trauma, there is so much shame that is created as a result of that, in part because of the secrecy. So it's working through shame is a very long process, but it can be done. And I can say that with absolute confidence because I had shame around everything. Everything about who I was, everything about what I did. So much shame. And I can honestly say now that I don't have shame about anything. Of course, there are times that I feel bad. If I've done something or forgotten something or said something, like I can feel bad. I can feel guilt, but that is not the same as shame. And while I can still even feel regretful of some things that I have done in my life, I no longer hold shame about them because I've made a lot of mistakes in my life for sure. Isabella says, I think being in a group helps with healing in a different way than individual therapy, which is so very important. It's something to do with being accepted by several people changes things. I had a negative response from someone to my history this week, but I saw it as her issue fairly quickly instead of my shame. Isabella, thank you so much for sharing that. And it's such a great example, I think, of how that can really transition. And you're right. And I've said this since I first started doing this work, in part because of my own experience in group work as a participant. There is absolutely, without a doubt, stuff that you get from participating in a group that you could never get in individual work, no matter how amazing a therapist may be, how skilled, how experienced, how many clients they've had, doesn't matter. There are many things that are healing about a group experience that is just not possible in a one-on-one situation. And of course, there are things that you get one-on-one that you can't get in a group experience. But the group healing experience, and I believe this really forever since my own experience as a participant, I think group is a really important part of the healing journey. I think that if you don't do a group at some point, you are really missing an important part of the depth of healing that you can actually do around the wounds, the core wounds that are there. And I'm really glad to hear you say that you were able to recognize that it was not your shame and that there was nothing for you to be ashamed of, that this was about somebody else. Barbara says, being in a safe group, which your groups are, is a great experience. Very vulnerable at times. However, the practice of showing up and participating simply as you are is incredibly healing. Barbara, thank you so much for sharing that, for your kind words as well. But this, I think, is such a foundational part. So being in a safe group, and that is important. And I will say that, groups can sometimes just inherently feel unsafe because it's vulnerable, because you're doubting yourself in that space. So it feels risky and it can feel, therefore, unsafe. But when you allow yourself to really experience it then you get to practice, you get to allow your body and your mind and your heart to really feel that it can be safe to be in a group or to share vulnerably, to talk about things that maybe you don't really allow yourself an opportunity to talk about. So that is really, I think, an incredibly important part of that. And what you said here, however, the practice of showing up and participating simply as you are is incredibly healing. Absolutely. And that, I would say that that is how the healing happens. And the simply as you are, that's a practice, because in the beginning, one of the things that tends to happen, and I can only speak to my groups, but is that in the beginning, there are sometimes quite a few people who, if this is their first group, don't really necessarily share a whole lot. They kind of just sit back and experience it and watch what's happening. But the more that they see how supportive and accepting and the experience, get to witness the experience, then it allows them to feel a little bit safer in being able to share. And so just that act of showing up simply as you are itself is such an important practice. And when you realize that you've been able to do that, there is healing at a depth that this is one of the ways why group, or how group is beneficial beyond individual work, is because it is a group setting. It's not just one person. There is, it just, you're able to absorb it, I guess is a way to say it, at a deeper level. Hi, Red. I think you may have shared your first name once before, but I'm not sure. Nicole says, is group ever just not a good idea? Can you just not be ready? Or could it make like flashbacks and stuff like that worse? That's a great question, Nicole. Thank you for asking. So yeah, I would say that there are times that group may not be the best thing for you for that particular time. I would say probably not indefinitely, but there's certainly maybe times that a group might not be the best thing. Just like with therapy in general, it can potentially bring up some things that haven't necessarily been very present. And I will say this too, and I actually haven't said this, so I'm glad this is coming up. I do think, especially if somebody has not, is kind of early on in their healing journey, or maybe has never done group before, I do think ideally that somebody would be doing individual work at the same time that they're doing group work. And this is, even if you're doing a group in person somewhere, doing both can be really, really beneficial, because there are going to be things that come up in group naturally, and that's part of the practice and experience of group and healing in general. If you're in individual, then you can bring up the things that come up for you in group into your individual work to process, because the things that come up in group, like what comes up when you're doing your individual work, is sometimes a little bit more narrow, because it's just this back and forth between the two of you. When you're in a group experience, you're hearing what other people are sharing, you're experiencing your own vulnerability as a participant or a member of the group. There are different things that people are talking about. So naturally, there's going to be a lot more kind of coming in than just in your one-on-one work. But that's not a bad thing. That actually can be really beneficial, because then you begin to recognize like when something comes up, and I'm just trying to think, for example, so one of the things that can happen in any sort of group setting is it can be a little bit like a sibling relationship. And sibling relationships can be beautiful, right? And they can be best friends throughout their entire life. But particularly as children, sibling relationships inherently have some things built into them that make comparison pretty common. ideas about different things, like being, an older child versus a middle child versus the youngest child, and all of that kind of stuff. So none of it is necessarily wrong or bad, or certainly doesn't mean that you shouldn't have more than one child. But it kind of just inherently brings in some things. So similar kinds of things can happen in group, not necessarily around just sibling stuff, but it can bring up things that you wouldn't necessarily have brought up in your regular everyday life. Being able to talk about that in your individual work can be really helpful, because you may not ever really have a circumstance that would present itself that would cause you to recognize, oh, I really noticed this happening. I noticed feeling like this when this prompt came up, or I noticed when somebody shared this that I found myself thinking about this. Processing what happens in group and individual can actually be a really important part of the overall healing that you are doing. So, in addition, I would say that if you are in a place where you feel like you're in crisis, there may be some groups actually that could be beneficial for you that are more crisis oriented. But in a group that's designed around healing from like childhood trauma, if you're in crisis, I think you could still potentially benefit from a group experience, like an online group experience anyway. So maybe not in person, because that's much more kind of confrontational in a way, like you're actually having to show up with people. So I think there still could be some benefit, but it is possible because there are going to be people sharing things, right? And for the most part, I mean, people do share some really personal things at times, but with this particular type of group that I'm talking about right now, the Returning to Wholeness Sisterhood, people do share deep and personal things, but not necessarily like details or like really triggering types of things. I mean, it does happen, and of course, anything can be triggering to somebody at a particular time, but we're not, the purpose of the group is not to really get into a lot of really difficult kinds of things. Like, my prompts can cause you as an individual to go deep. But I'm not necessarily asking people to do things in a group setting that are really kind of deep and personal in nature. So, doing group can definitely bring up some things. And that is part of the reason that I really recommend that people are in seeing somebody individually. It doesn't necessarily have to be every week, but definitely great benefit in seeing somebody individually if you're doing group work. Yolanta says, I have a lot of self-attacking thoughts, a lot of blame, unworthy, all my fault. You're definitely not alone. Taking too much responsibility. Well, that's enough, I think, that you're holding on to there. And definitely, I don't know where you are in this healing journey, but the blame that you're holding on to, and obviously I don't know specifically what you're referring to, but again, you're here in this space watching me talk, and you probably know who I am or what I talk about. So the blame that you are holding on to, that self-blame that you're holding on to, is not something for you to take responsibility for. We naturally do for a few different reasons. And part of healing is being able to release that sense of responsibility and blame. But it is not your fault. No matter what, but you come up with, it is not your fault. And that if we're talking about childhood trauma, that I can promise. And there is very little. Anybody who's followed me for any period of time really knows that I rarely promise anything at all related to this healing process. But if we're talking about childhood trauma, I can promise you and you're the one that experienced it, I can promise you that it is not your fault. Being able to get to a place where you can fully trust that to be true, that is what healing is about. It's getting to that place because it is not your fault. So every aspect of healing childhood trauma kind of deals with all of these pieces, at least from my perspective or the way that I tend to work. So ultimately, a lot of what you shared here, Yolanta, is being able to kind of separate out, and this is a process, this is a practice as well, being able to separate out the reality of your experience, your lived experience, and what you believe about your experience. So one of the things that I say all the time is that it's not necessarily the trauma that creates the long-term impact, it's the meaning that we attach to it. And the meaning that you've attached to it is what you're saying to yourself in those self-attacking thoughts, the blame, the responsibility, believing that it's your fault. Though that's the meaning that you've attached to it. And so healing ultimately is about changing your core beliefs to what is true, not what you've always believed. Hello, butterfly stickers. Barbara says, until this week, I hadn't realized how feeling impatient with myself because I was struggling was me shaming me. That was good to see because then I could practice being more compassionate towards me. Let me read this again. I hadn't realized how feeling impatient with myself. Okay, good. Because you were struggling and feeling shame about that. Yes. And again, I think this is such a really interesting example of how really easily and kind of unconsciously shame can dictate. Like it really can drive. If we think about our, like, what drives our behavior in terms of survival, right? When we are holding on to shame, like our fight or flight, or our hunger and eating and our thirst for drinking to keep us alive, the impact of shame, how it shows up in our body and what that does, the system that it activates within us is somewhat similar in terms of how it drives us. It really is incredibly impactful. I'm really glad that you were able to recognize that. And I love what you said here about this was good to see because then I could practice being more compassionate towards yourself. Yes, self-compassion is absolutely so important. Kara says, I need to rewatch this and learn more about how shame can affect your nervous system. I feel shame when I can't control my body, like when I have a panic attack. This is a really big one, Kara, for so many people. And it is, I think, interesting. And I'd need to give it a little bit more thought to really connect these two things. But what's happening in our body for survivors of childhood trauma, that is often, no matter what it is that's happening inside our body, even an illness can create shame, or can be a trigger, maybe is a better way to say that, for shame to come up. It really is so interesting. And whether it's physical abuse or sexual abuse, of course, there's going to be a connection there, but that shame that can come up, like even being injured. I know I have felt that, and many people have shared this with me over the years too. Like you get injured and you end up feeling shame. And sometimes you feel shame because you feel like you caused it and you're a klutz or whatever, but it can actually be much deeper than that. And without you even having to feel like somehow you're responsible for it. So that is an interesting thing there. Shame is incredibly impactful. And I keep talking about maybe doing a workshop on shame. I just don't know that anybody would sign up for it because it's not something people typically want to talk about, but it's so important. So that might still be something we do. And we do talk about shame, certainly in my groups as well. Hi, Cheryl. I couldn't imagine being in a group. Well, a lot of people can't. I know before I did my first one, if somebody had said, next year at this time, you're going to be in a support group, I would have, I don't know what I would have done, but it probably wouldn't have been very agreeable, I guess I would say. I really couldn't have imagined myself doing it. And I will also say that, particularly in person, not so much since I've been online, I think because people know more about me since I started my work online. But when I had my in-person practice and I would run a group, I would talk to some of my clients about it. And they're like, oh, I don't know. I don't think I could do that. Or, just a lot of uncertainty about it. And inevitably, and I can say this, inevitably, everybody that joined my groups at the end, or not even at the end, sometimes even after the first night, were so glad that they did. And again, often would join another group. And that's part of the reason why I talk about this so much, because all that uncertainty, the doubt, the fear, it really can hold us back so significantly. And it makes sense. Like, we can make all the reasons make sense in our mind as to why we shouldn't do it, why it's not the right time, why you have to wait until you get to a certain point or place to be able to do it, why it's not for you. So many things. And I've heard them all. And like I said, I've had many clients over the years, including also with virtual group, because even though people might understand more about group, there's still a lot of apprehension. But then they're glad that they did. So you're definitely not alone in that. Isabella says, before I ever did a group, I was scared that I would be overwhelmed by the details of other people's stories. That has never happened, as the details haven't been the focus. Can you talk about that? Sure. So thank you actually for sharing this too. And I think this is actually a fear that a lot of people have about going to therapy in general, right? Is I'm going to have to talk about things. And if you've watched many of my videos, you probably know that from my perspective, healing is not about talking about details. Doesn't mean you can't, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't. But we don't need to talk about all the details in order to heal, because again, going back to what I said a little bit ago, the long-term impact, the self-doubt, the shame, the unworthiness, the relationship struggles, it's the meaning that we've attached to the experience. So in my groups, we tend to focus on self-care and worthiness, and leaning into support and noticing what is present for you, honoring yourself, various kinds of things like that. And people will sometimes share, like, I remember this, or I always believed this, and stuff like that. So they might share some details about something, but the focus of the group, and even typically what that person is sharing, is not so much about that. It's more about, this is what I'm feeling, or this is what I'm thinking. And in being able to share, and even for other people to read what you're sharing, there is healing that happens in that for the person sharing, because they are expressing themselves, they're honoring themselves, they're supported in what they're sharing, they're believed in what they're sharing. And for the person reading, they get to experience the truth that they're not alone, and they get to witness vulnerability, and that it can be safe to share vulnerably and to have people there who get it and understand. So I think that is a really significant part of it, because group is vulnerable. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, oh, it's all wonderful and we just get together and have a great old time. we do. I think we do have a wonderful time together, and we even can laugh together. But there is vulnerability in there because you are allowing yourself to lean into showing up as you are, to Barbara's comment earlier. You're allowing yourself to practice being witnessed, to sharing things. Like one of the posts that I often tend to do is just acknowledging what's present for you right now. How can we support you? How can we celebrate you? And even sharing things to celebrate can feel really vulnerable. But it's an opportunity for practice. Everything that happens in the group experience, at least in my groups, everything that happens is part of the practicing. Everything. Even if you're reading a post and you're not commenting on it, reading it and choosing not to comment on that moment is a practice. If you come back to it and comment, that's a practice. If you react to the post or to somebody's comment, that's a practice. Everything is about the practice, and healing happens only through practicing in whatever way that might look. So Isabella, if there's something in particular that I didn't address, feel free to share it, and I'm happy to do that. I don't think we have, Rebecca says, I don't think we have groups like that in UK. I'm assuming you're talking about like in-person support groups. I know that I've had clients that have been in various places in the UK, and I know that it can be challenging to find. So I don't know if there would be an in-person group in your area, but one of the reasons that I do the groups online is because I do have clients that are kind of all over the place, and this allows people, no matter where they are in the world, to join us. And in this particular group, while there will be a couple of live Q&As, you don't have to participate live. You just come in the group and do it on your own time whenever you want. So time makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. And actually, an interesting thing that has come up is because there are people all over the globe, all different kinds of time zones, that sometimes, like if somebody's having difficulty sleeping, they'll come into the group, and somebody who, like it's a normal awake time for them, will also be in the group at the same time. So that's kind of an interesting experience, and a really great benefit actually to having people in different places in the world that I hadn't actually thought about when I started doing this. Yolanda says, deep childhood trauma, no contact with my family. You're definitely not alone. And that is a challenging thing, to make that decision. There can be a lot of healing and release that happens in making that decision. There can also be a lot of questioning yourself, wondering if you've done the right thing, having doubts about it and stuff like that. It can bring up a lot. But sometimes it is absolutely the best thing, the healthiest thing for everybody actually involved to make that decision. And I've known so many people over the years that have had to make that decision. So you're definitely not alone. You're welcome. And Nicole, you're welcome as well. Hello there, Ruru. Kara says, yes, I would sign up for that workshop. That's good to know. So stay tuned. This year I am thinking I might do a couple different ones. Kelly says she would sign up for one on shame too. All right, Cheryl says me too. All right. Well, stay tuned. If you are not on my email list, make sure to sign up, because I'll be sharing definitely through my email list. And then I know a lot of you are not on social media, so you wouldn't see me sharing on social media. And unfortunately, the only way that I can share it really on YouTube for anybody to see it is to create a video. And most people don't really want to watch a video about my offers. So Rebecca says, I would be terrified of falling to bits in front of people in a group. I would say that that's one of the benefits of doing a virtual group as well, because you're not live interacting other than the Q&As, but that's, you're not actually, like you can participate live, but you're still on your computer. And while I know it can feel incredibly difficult and it can even bring up shame to kind of fall to bits, is that doing that in a container like this is that while it can bring up a lot of difficult feelings and fears and doubts and all of that, there can also be such incredible healing to be held in a space that where you're feeling into all of that. Kelly says, I worry that in a group I might say or do something that could negatively impact others. I may say too much or maybe not enough or not be supportive or caring enough. I might not know what to say. Kelly, thank you for sharing that. I know that this is something that a lot of people struggle with, even if they never really express it, or maybe even don't even necessarily recognize it as being something that is really present for them. So I do want to address this because I think whether it's my groups or even like a group of friends that you meet with in person, I think this is an important thing. And obviously this is my perspective. We all have the potential to negatively impact somebody else. And sometimes that could be because we are being rude, disrespectful, or just kind of careless. Now, rude and disrespectful is something separate, and I'm not going to address that because generally speaking, I'm not going to be concerned about people in my groups being rude or disrespectful. Of course, somebody could be, but that's generally not going to be the case. Now, being careless, and that's not a judgment, but just in general, something like that can happen, right? So we're not talking about like somebody who just tends to be rude, inconsiderate. We're not talking about that kind of thing. But sometimes we can be careless. And that's, again, that's not a negative trait necessarily. I'm not referring to it in that way. So we can say something that could negatively impact from a careless standpoint. But we can also say something that may negatively impact somebody else without us saying anything at all that is negative or wrong or bad or careless or anything like that. Because how somebody else feels in a group setting, so I'm kind of being more specific about this, is going to have to do a lot with where they are at. Now, I want to be clear that, of course, somebody could say something that, like the majority of people would interpret in a particular way that might seem like it could negatively impact them, right? So that can happen. But for the most part, like going back to the idea of details, right? So this is where this can come up a lot. I'm afraid if I share this, then somebody's going to be triggered, for example. And I get that. And I think on one hand, it's good to be considerate of that for sure. But I also think it's important to recognize that, especially in a space where part of what you might be sharing is, I don't know, like I'm really struggling because I almost got in a car accident today and it brought up memory of something that is traumatic, right? So somebody could share something like that, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with sharing something like that. In fact, my spaces are typically going to be a space where I would want you to share whatever it is you're struggling with. So somebody could read that and have their own memory come up, or find that they're feeling the sense of panic, maybe even empathizing with you. But there's a difference between somebody empathizing. There's a difference between somebody having something kind of like a memory of theirs triggered. There's a difference between those things and you doing something that's negatively impacting somebody else. And I know that that may not make sense for a lot of people because you might be too caught up in, oh my God, I've done something wrong, to be able to kind of separate those things out. And I would have been in that place too. I wouldn't have been able to separate that out. I would have been saying, well, but if I'm doing that, and as a result, this is happening, that it's my fault that this has happened. And no, it isn't. Because people can have things come up for them, even empathy, right? That isn't somebody else's fault that we are empathic and attuned to other people's feelings. It's not your fault. It's not your fault that you shared that. That's making us be empathic. And feeling empathy for somebody or having our own memories come up isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially the empathy part. But even having our own memories come up doesn't have to be a bad thing. In fact, this is actually a really good example of why having an individual therapist can be really helpful, because you can go to your individual therapist then and say, somebody shared this in the group and I found myself thinking about this and I found myself really struggling afterward. And that's something that they can work on in therapy. Another thing that can happen is that, especially because it's written, and we all know that things can be misconstrued, misinterpreted, miscommunicated, all of the above in communicating in general, but especially in written form. And we can only control how we're expressing something. We can't control how somebody receives it. It is important to recognize that we control what we're expressing or how we're expressing something. It doesn't mean that you need to be obsessed about it. It doesn't mean that you need to consume yourself with how all the different possible ways it could sound. It just means, what is my intention in sharing this? And is the way I'm sharing it in integrity with that intention? So it's not about, and for the most part, generally speaking, that's going to be a natural thing. It isn't going to take up a lot of energy to figure that out. But that's kind of the difference. So again, even if this is a group of friends, this same thing applies. In terms of like responding to other people or saying something to somebody else, like if they comment and you respond to them, going back to what Barbara said earlier about, and I don't remember the exact words right now, basically showing up as you are or who you are, right? We, in a group setting, and I know me as the facilitator, as the one facilitating the healing happening in here, I want you to show up as you are. If you're somebody who tends to share a lot, then share a lot. If you're somebody who doesn't share for whatever reason, you struggle with what to say, or you're just not really big on responding to people, then show up as you are. Some people are going to respond quickly. Some people will take a few days. Some people are going to share a lot. Some people are going to just say, me too. There's no right or wrong. Some days, and I know this is true for me, some days I feel like, for whatever reason, like I can share, like I can respond in really more like lengthy, detailed ways. And other days I feel like, and not because of what I'm responding to necessarily at all, but just because of where I'm at, that I might write one sentence. And one isn't right or wrong. It's just where I'm at that particular time. And that's okay. And to the point of, I might not know what to say. Just be yourself. There isn't anything that you should or need to say. In a group setting, the group facilitator is the facilitator. The group facilitator is the one that has a role to play in regard of what, like if there's something that needs to be said or something like that, the facilitator has the responsibility for that. No participant has a responsibility to do or say anything in anything at all, and certainly not in any particular way. But that fear, I think, is what holds a lot of people back from sharing. And that is one of the things when I was referring to how sometimes people will not really participate. And then over time, as they witness things happening, they'll maybe participate because they recognize that it doesn't have to look a specific way. Because the idea that things need to look a specific way holds us back from a lot. I know it does for me, particularly it used to. So that can really hold us back, but it doesn't have to look a certain way. And everybody is different, and that's part of the value of participating in a group. Rebecca says, it's really hard to be relaxed in a totally artificial and unrelaxing environment. I'd have to sit around a bonfire in a group. I'd be up for that. Yes, that is a lovely idea. Cheryl says, I often feel peaceful in the group, even if I feel unsure of myself at times too. Cheryl, thank you so much for sharing that. And it is interesting how both of those things can be present. And I would say that that's actually part of the practice of healing too, is recognizing that we have the capacity for both at the same time. Rebecca, I'm glad that you were here as well. And I appreciate you being part of our community. I know that you watch the videos and share in the comments quite often, so thank you. All right, well, thank you all for being here. And if you are watching this on replay, thank you for watching all of this. And if you are watching this on replay, please don't hesitate to ask questions. We start on Monday inside a private Facebook group. So if that's something that is of interest to you, make sure to check out the link in the pinned post. Although if you're watching this on replay, I will share it in a pinned comment. So you can actually in the description and in a pinned comment, so you can access it easily. Thank you, Isabella, for sharing as well. So thank you, and I would love to connect with you inside the Sisterhood starting on Monday. Have a beautiful weekend, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye, Barbara.